Welcome to the Find Your Ideal Champion video for Season 10. This is the fourth year that I've done this video. Every year I try to improve upon it and I try to make it better. I take the feedback that you guys give me and I try to work it in. And I think this one is a little bit better than last year. I definitely think the last year was a huge jump in my quality. This year it definitely is better. But I feel like I'm almost reaching that peak a little bit. I'll have to come up with some clever ways to make it even better for Season 11. But the whole point of this is that there's a ton of champions in League of Legends. There's over 140, we're almost at 150 now. And for a new player, or even for a veteran player, it's near impossible to figure out what champion you want. You got to spend a lot of hours trying to figure out what champion you want to play. And there aren't that many guides to kind of help you try and figure out what type of play style is right for you. And that's what the purpose of this stream and this video is going to be. And what I do is I break down all of the champions into 7 classes, which are further broken down into 13 subclasses. And this is based off of a system that Riot created, but they haven't really kept up on it. So I basically took that system, I've modified it, I've made it my own. And I think it's a pretty good system. And basically what we're going to do is we're going to have 6 attributes that you can choose, and based on what you say for those 6 attributes, it'll help you figure out what's the best champion for you. Alright, so right off the bat, because I get a lot of questions on what changed and new champions and things like that. So this is kind of the delta that you'll see between the Season 9 video and the Season 10 video. So new champions. I added Sylas to Specialists. I added Yuumi to Enchanters. I added Qiyana to Assassins. I added Senna to Marksman. Aphelios to Marksman. And I know that Set isn't... he just was released, but we don't have a lot of data on him. But I've added him to Juggernauts. And we'll see how he shakes out. My bet is that he's probably going to stay in Juggernauts. For the reworks, Ezreal got that little tiny rework. He's still a marksman. Kale's a specialist. Morgana's still a catcher. Mordekaiser is still a juggernaut. Pantheon is still a diver. Garen is still a juggernaut. He had a little tiny rework. And Diana remains a diver. So those are all of the changes from Season 9 to the Season 10 video. So the next thing I want to talk about is special thanks. So I love getting community feedback. That is something that I really thrive on, and I love it. So these are 4 people that really helped me connect the dots in order to make this video. So we got JR Artis. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that right, but he came up with a really cool relationship between skirmishers and juggernauts. We got Crit Keeper, whose original post helped define what skirmishers are. We got Ananagon. He did the differences between skirmishers and divers. And we got Dragon Shay, who defined juggernauts. He was the one who defined the raid bosses as opposed to the freight trains stuff. And as you can see, there's plenty of room still left on this slide. So I'm always looking for community feedback. I'm always looking for ways to make myself better. And I definitely want to give a shout out to these 4 people because they definitely made this topic way better than it was in the past. So let's get into it. 7 basic classes. So we got Slayers, Fighters, Tanks, Controllers, Mages, and then Marksmen and Specialists. So you can see I got 5 of the classes arrayed in a spectrum. And I've got the Marksman, the Specialist in the center. Marksman and Specialists are in the center because they are so diverse, they basically have their own spectrum. The 5 on the outside, those ones all kind of relate to each other. So the way that this is set up is that it's not like Magic the Gathering where like the ones on one side counter the ones on the other side. It's more about which classes have the most synergy between them. So Slayers are most common to Fighters and Mages. Fighters are most common to Slayers and Tanks, etc., etc., etc. So it's not who counters who, it's more like who they are closest to. So yeah, so the basics of the classes are that Slayers are kind of the melee carries. They're typically high damage and high mobility, but they typically don't have a lot of defenses. Fighters are kind of that middle ground. They're not quite as high damage as Slayers, but they're not as tanky as the Tanks. You've got the tanks, who are obviously the tankiest champions in the game. You've got controllers, who are more focused on utility and crowd control as opposed to like raw damage or raw tankiness. And then you've got the mages, who are longer range spellcasters, who have a lot of burst damage in them as well. And then marksmen, range DPS, specialists are kind of all over the place. So once we get into the classes, we can further break these down into the subclasses. So you can see I've added a bunch of these. Those are all the subclasses. And the way it's oriented is we've got 13 subclasses total. The classes that I consider to be the offensive subclasses are on the outside, and the ones that I consider to be the defensive subclasses are on the inside. So the offensive subclasses would be assassins, divers, vanguards, catchers, burst mages, artillery mages. And on the inside, those are the defensive subclasses, and those would be skirmishers, juggernauts, wardens, enchanters, and battle mages. And really, the difference between the offensive and the defensive is like whether they prefer to actually engage the fight or they prefer to be engaged upon. So like juggernauts are fantastic at getting engaged upon. They're really, really tanky. They deal a lot of damage. Divers, on the other hand, they want to engage onto the opponent. They want to start the fight. They don't want the fight to come to them. Real fast, I'll go over the subclasses real quick. So assassins, high mobility, high burst damage. Skirmishers, also high mobility, but they have more DPS damage, and they're basically better designed to be duelists as opposed to being able to pop somebody like an assassin can. Divers, they're kind of primary engage, have a lot of CC, have a lot of mobility, have a lot of good single target damage. Juggernaut, really tanky, have a lot of damage, not very mobile. Tanks, vanguards are kind of the engaged tanks. They have a lot of AoE crowd control and AoE damage. Wardens are the more supportive tanks. They have a lot of peel. They have a lot of crowd control. They're not as mobile as the vanguards, but they have more utility. On the controller side, catchers, best crowd control in the game. They're just fantastic at crowd control, and they have a decent amount of utility. Enchanters have the best utility in the game, a little bit worse crowd control and not as much damage. For the mages, burst mages and artillery mages, those are like your long-range damage dealers. From a burst perspective, artillery mages do have a bit more DPS than the burst mages. And the battle mages, this is kind of your mid-range mage that has a lot of DPS damage and also is a bit more tanky than your burst mages and your artillery mages. So we've got 6 attributes. So I added one. Last year it was 5. Now we're on to 6. I added the range attribute. There are 6 attributes. Yeah, feel free to ask questions. No problem. I'll try to catch up to them whenever I get a chance. But we got damage, we got toughness, we got crowd control, mobility, utility, and range. So obviously damage is how much damage you want to deal. There's a spectrum for each one of these attributes. So for damage, you can go between DPS or burst. So burst damage is like you deal the damage within a second or two. It's very quick, it's very abrupt, and it usually is enough damage to kill a squishy target outright. DPS damage is better against tankier champions. It basically means you have continual damage that you can output for a long period of time. So DPS damage is better for like long team fights. Burst damage is better for just like picking somebody from Fog of War, that type of stuff. For toughness, we've got mitigation, we've got sustain. So mitigation is more like shields, damage reduction, things that actually like mitigate a percentage of the damage. So mitigation is better against burst damage. Sustain is things like healing, stuff like that. So sustain is better against DPS damage. So typically mitigation is stronger, but sustain allows you to heal for a longer period of time. So mitigation is stronger in a short period of time, which is why it's so good against burst damage. For next, we got crowd control. There's soft crowd control and there's hard crowd control. So hard crowd control is basically anything that like prevents movement of your characters. So you're talking roots, stuns, knockups, knockbacks, any type of displacement abilities, suppressions, all of that stuff. All of that is hard crowd control. Soft crowd control is things like silence, blind, slow, things like that. Things that don't necessarily like, you can still use your champion, you just might not be able to use a certain aspect of your champion. Like if you're blinded, you can't auto attack, or if you're silenced, you can't use spells, things like that. Mobility, we have engage and reposition. So engage is like long range, I'm starting a fight, kind of I'm going in type of abilities. Reposition is more about kind of position yourself in the best spot available. So you would say like movement, speed abilities, or really short range dashes would be more reposition abilities. And those longer range dashes or those big ultimates, those would be the engage abilities. For utility, there's defensive and there's offensive. So utility is all about buffing your opponent. So crowd control is about making your opponents weaker. Utility is all about making your allies stronger. So utility, there can be defensive and there's offensive. So defensives would be like shielding, healing, things like that. Things that make the defensive abilities of your allies stronger. And then offensive utility would be things like attack speed boosts, damage boosts, things like that. Things that make the offensive abilities of your allies stronger. And the final one is range. So you can have either attacks or abilities. And this is more like, does your champion prefer more abilities or they prefer more auto attacks? Obviously, marksman would be on the auto attack side of the spectrum, and something like artillery mages would be on the ability side of the spectrum. So it's a question of, do you prioritize more your abilities or your auto attacks? So the big thing with this is that you guys need to prioritize which of these is most important to you. So is damage more important than toughness? Is crowd control more important than mobility? You guys need to decide what's the most important, and I would highly recommend that you guys kind of order these from most important to least important in your heads. Just think about it. What do you really care about in a champion? Because there's always got to be trade-offs. There's always trade-offs with these champions. No champion is phenomenal at everything. And that's what I'm going to illustrate with this next graphic. So you can see here that you've got all 6 of the attributes: damage, toughness, crowd control, mobility, utility, and range. And then we've got the classes on the left. I've abbreviated them by their first 3 letters. So we've got ASS for assassin, because you are an ass if you main assassin. And obviously you got WAR for wardens, things like that, MAR for marksmen, that type of stuff. So you can see that every single class, there's only 1 or 2 of these attributes that they're kind of S tier in. So for assassins, they're S tier in damage and they're S tier in mobility. But you can see that they're D tier when it comes to toughness and utility. So you can see that there's all these trade-offs. No class is phenomenal at everything. Some classes are kind of jack of all trades and they're all kind of that B tier type abilities. And some of them are really, really... they have like 1 or 2 S tiers and then a bunch of like C or D tiers, things like that. So that's kind of the whole point of this, is to illustrate that no champion is great at everything. And this is also to kind of give you like a little cheat sheet so you guys can see what each class is good at, what each class is worse at. All right, so let's get into the actual attributes. So we've got, first up is damage. And as you can see, there is a ton of champions that deal a lot of damage in League of Legends. League of Legends is very damage heavy. So you can see basically like the champions at the top are the highest damage, champions at the bottom are the lowest damage. Champions on the left are DPS, champions on the right are burst. So at the very top, we've got marksmen as the high damage, high DPS, then battle mages and skirmishers kind of more in the middle. Going over to the burst side, artillery mages, burst mages, and assassins. So skirmishers and artillery mages kind of do a little bit of, they're kind of in the middle. They both do DPS and burst damage. Next below them, we've got Juggernauts. Juggernauts are squarely in the DPS category. Put them right beneath the battle mages. For beneath the Juggernauts, we've got catchers and divers. Catchers and divers are kind of weird when it comes to damage because it really depends on the champion and the build. So for catchers, it depends on the champion. There's certain catchers that deal a ton of damage. I think like Zyra is one of them, for example. Nico is one of them, for example. Divers, it's more dependent upon their build. So divers have like a really, really diverse build set. So you can build a diver like full damage or full tank, and that will obviously adjust how much damage they deal. But just as far as like base numbers, they're kind of in that middle of the road with the catchers when it comes to their damage. Beneath them, we've got Wardens and Vanguards. So both Wardens and Vanguards could do DPS damage. Yes, you can build them full AP or full AD and deal, a ton of burst damage, but that's obviously not how their kits are designed. You can play, say, like Malphite as a full AP, and he's obviously going to do a lot of burst damage. But as far as like the actual kits and the base damages and things like that, they're designed for DPS damage. And then at the bottom, I've got the enchanters. So enchanters can do obviously a lot of damage. If you've ever seen a full AP Sona, things like that, they deal a ton of damage. But in general, enchanters do the least amount of damage in the game compared to the other classes. But pretty much every class can do damage. Like I've seen, Nautiluses and Poppies and Sonas and Yumis deal the most damage in the game. So it's possible for any class to carry when it comes to damage. But in general, those classes that are near the bottom, they aren't going to do as much damage as the other classes. Next up, we've got the Toughness. Yeah, I definitely did. Sorry, I'm looking at chat. Definitely redid the diagrams because I felt like they were a little bit cluttered. I felt like this makes it a little bit cleaner. So hopefully you guys appreciate that. It does give away a little bit of the ranges that certain champions can have. Like, for example, catchers, when it comes to damage and their toughness, they're kind of all over the map. So this doesn't really demonstrate that, but I'm hoping that I can talk to those points instead of having to clutter up a graphic. So when it comes to toughness, Vanguards, Wardens, and Juggernauts are the big guys when it comes to their toughness. So Vanguards and Wardens mainly have mitigation toughness, but there are a few Wardens that have got some sustain. Juggernauts are mainly sustain. There's a few of them that have shields here and there, but they're mainly on the sustain side of things. And they really are the tankiest champions in the game. Next up, we've got divers. So divers can be less tanky or more tanky depending on how they build, as we previously discussed with their damage. But in general, divers are really innately tanky. They pretty much all of them have some form of sustain or some form of shield that they have, some form of damage reduction, things like that, in order to stay alive on those front lines. Beneath them, we've got the skirmishers and battle mages. So skirmishers, a lot of their defenses are very conditional. We'll talk about that more later when we get to the skirmishers. And then battle mages, it's a little bit hit or miss. Battle mages usually have unconventional forms of toughness. There's a few that are really, really tanky, like Swain and Vladimir. And then you've got some that aren't as tanky, like, say, Talia or something like that. But usually there's, champions like Rumble. He's got some tankiness. Rise has got the shield. You've got Anivia with her egg. There's all sorts of weird things that battle mages do in order to stay alive, even though their range is a little bit shorter than some of the other champions. Next up, we've got catchers. I've got them at right beneath the skirmishers and the battle mages. Catchers, again, they're one of those classes that can vary greatly as far as their toughness. In general, if you're going for a catcher that has more damage, they're going to have less toughness. So you can see like Zyra, Nico, those type of champions. High damage, low toughness. If you go for a champion that has more toughness, you're going to have less damage. Think like a Thresh or a Blitzcrank, things like that. So it's all about trade-offs. You're not going to get everything in a single champion. And at the bottom, for toughness, we've got burst mages, artillery mages, enchanters, assassins, and marksmen. These all don't have a lot of toughness. You can see that a lot of the champions that were the highest when it comes to damage are also the lowest when it comes to toughness. And that's usually a trade-off you have to make. The only exception to that would be Juggernauts and battle mages for the most part. They have a little bit of both. Okay. Next up for crowd control, so you can see that the graphic is really, really skewed towards hard crowd control. The people who designed the League of Legends champions seem to love hard crowd control. Every champion's got to have a knock-up or a stun. I would definitely like to see more champions that have things like blinds and silences and things like that, but some people consider those forms of crowd control to be kind of even more toxic than a knockback or a knock-up or a stun. But anyway, at the top, we've got the Wardens, Catchers, and Vanguards. Those really are your kings and queens of crowd control. They've got more crowd control in their kits than pretty much anybody else. Right beneath them, we've got Enchanters, Burst Mages, and Divers. Again, great crowd control on these champions, but usually it's only one form of crowd control or it's a little bit harder to hit, things like that. Divers usually have their engage tied to a form of crowd control, that type of stuff. Burst Mages is usually like a single crowd control that's super important that they hit. Beneath that, we've got Battle Mages and Artillery Mages. Usually, these champions, like Artillery Mages, have decent crowd control, but it's usually a little bit harder to hit. Battle Mages, their crowd control is actually pretty strong. They're actually pushing potentially into the same range as like the Enchanters and Burst Mages. And then for beneath them, we've got Assassins, Marksmen, and Skirmishers. So this is a change from the last season. I had marksmen, I believe, with Juggernauts. I've now moved them up, and the reason for that is that it seems like every marksman they're releasing recently, besides like Kai'Sa, has some form of crowd control. So it seems like, personally, what I think is happening is because damage is getting so out of control and mobility is getting so out of control, they're trying to give classes that traditionally didn't have a lot of crowd control, they're giving them more crowd control. Like, for example, marksman. Like, it used to be like, it was like Ash Varus were the main champions, the main marksman that had, good crowd control. But it seems like there's more and more champions that have crowd control. Zaya's got her root, Philios has got a root. Lots of these new marksmen have a lot of crowd control abilities. Skirmishers and assassins. So assassins are actually one of the only classes that have more soft crowd control than hard crowd control. You see like a lot of slows with assassins, things like that. Skirmishers, they usually have at least one form of crowd control in their kit, and it's usually a very important form of crowd control. Like if a skirmisher hits their crowd control, champion dead, usually. At the bottom, we've got Juggernauts. Juggernauts tend to have a little bit of crowd control, some more than others, but really they have the least amount of crowd control in the game. But obviously, even they have crowd control. And there are some examples of Juggernauts that have a ton of crowd control. Like the one that stands out to me is Skarner. Skarner's got a fantastic amount of crowd control. He is part of the Juggernaut class. So Juggernauts do have a bit of range when it comes to crowd control. On to the mobility. So mobility, really, assassins. Assassins are at the top. I know that I've got divers and skirmishers with them, but assassins really have the most mobility, arguably, in the game. They really can just get in, get out, super fast, very mobile. Divers and skirmishers also have a fantastic amount of mobility. Divers are more on that engage side. They want to start those fights. Skirmishers are more on the reposition side. They want to start dueling. They want to outsmart people. They want to reposition in a way that they can do a 1v2 or 1v3. Right beneath them, I've got Vanguards. So Vanguards typically have really, really monumental mobility, but it's usually on their ultimate. It's usually like big ultimate, go in, has crowd control associated. Think like Malphite ultimate or Nautilus ultimate, things like that. So yeah, they have like big mobility abilities. They're usually on a much longer cooldown. So they're a little bit less mobile than the other classes, but their mobility when they use it is usually like really important. It's really impactful. Beneath Vanguards, I've got Wardens and Catchers. So Catchers, typically their mobility is a bit more situational. For Wardens and Catchers, basically the Wardens, their mobility a lot of times is tied to other champions sometimes, or they're really reliant upon other people getting that initial engage off, and they're great at a follow-up engage. Catchers as well, they have got decent mobility, but it's a lot of times it's situational. Think like Bard tunnels around the map, Thresh landing a hook, things like that. Beneath them, we've got Burst Mages, Juggernauts, Marksmen, and Enchanters. So these classes, it's not every champion has got mobility in these classes. There's usually only a few that have mobility within these classes. So they're usually, like, for example, Juggernauts, raid bosses, not a lot of mobility. Freight trains, usually a lot more mobility, things like that. And then finally, we've got Artillery Mages and Battle Mages at the bottom, least mobile champions in the game. And there's only, like, very rare cases where they've got some form of mobility ability. Okay, on to utility. And you can see that this is kind of like the opposite of damage. So you can see that there's very few classes that have utility in this game. But utility is super important. So Enchanters, obviously, they are at the top. They have the most utility in the game, hands down. Right beneath them, we've got Wardens. Wardens also have fantastic utility, but not as good as the Enchanters. And then we've got Catchers right beneath them. So really, if you're looking for utility, it's those three classes: an Enchanter, Warden, Catcher. Those are the classes that will give you utility if your team needs it. And for some team compositions, utilities is really important. For example, like Protect, Siege, and Split. Usually they need utility in the composition to function really well. So beneath those three classes, we've got Vanguards, Burst Mages, Marksmen, and Battle Mages. Minimal utility. There's a few champions here there that have got some utility. So I can think of like Sivir, for example, or you can see like Vladimir. Vladimir ultimate is a damage amp. Things like that. Very little utility within those classes, but they got more than some of the other classes. At the bottom, we've got Artillery Mages, Juggernauts, Divers, Skirmishers, and Assassins. So they're at the bottom when it comes to utility, and pretty much most of those classes don't have any utility. Okay, on to the final attribute, which is range. So, at the top, we got to have marksmen and artillery mages. Those definitely are the champions that are known for their range more than anything. Marksmen, obviously, on the attack side, artillery mages, obviously, on the ability side. Right beneath them, enchanters and burst mages, also very long range champions. And usually their range is also tied to their mobility a lot of times. Beneath that, we've got catchers and battle mages. So those are kind of your mid-range champions. They're not going to have as long ranges as some of the other mages, but they typically gain something else. Either gain really good crowd control, or they gain some more toughness, things like that, in order to survive in those mid-ranges. Beneath that, we've got Juggernauts, Vanguards, and Assassins. So Assassins typically have abilities to do like wave clear from range. A lot of them do. Or they have some other type of ranged ability that's a little bit longer range than melee range. Same with Juggernauts. Their abilities usually extend outwards, or like some type of skill shot. Think like a Mordekaiser Q or an Aatrox Q, things like that. Same with Vanguards. They usually have abilities that allow them to farm a little bit from range or harass a little bit from range. And then at the very lowest ranges, we've got Divers, Skirmishers, and Wardens. These classes, they typically don't have abilities that allow them to farm from range as easily or harass from range as easily. There's a few here and there, but they're definitely the weakest when it comes to their range. All right, so I'm showing this again. Same slide that I showed before. This is basically just to show you once again, no class is great at everything. You got to pick and choose what's most important to you. You really, if you want to be a jack of all trades, you can, but you're not going to be S tier at everything. There is a lot of trade-offs that you're going to have to consider. So let's talk about front line, midline, and back line. So the E on this diagram is the enemy. So assuming you're blue side, you're trying to siege mid-outer tower. So your front line typically is going to consist of Divers, Vanguards, and Juggernauts. Your midline is mainly going to consist of catchers, wardens, and battle mages. Your backline is going to consist of the enchanters, marksmen, burst mages, and artillery mages. You can see we got the assassins and skirmishers off on the sides. They're kind of mid lane, but they like to be flanking a lot more. They'll typically be split pushing. Juggernauts can split push too, but typically if they are going to group with the team, they want to be in the front line, or they want to flank sometimes. In general, you want to have at least one of each of these. So you want to have at least one frontliner, at least one midliner, and at least one backliner. What you do with the other two champions is up to you, but it's usually good to have at least one of each as far as frontline, midline, and backline is concerned. So you can see that the who's in frontline, who's in midline, who's in backline isn't dependent just on the range. It also has to do with the champion's toughness and also their mobility. So typically you can see like divers have really short range, but they are frontliners because they have high mobility and they've got good toughness. Things like that. So it's not just the range that determines whether or not you're frontline or backline. It's also a lot of other factors that tie into whether or not you want to be near the front or near the back. Once again, there's the spectrum for you guys. Makes sense. All kind of feeds towards each other. I did also attempt to turn this into like a 3D model where I could show like almost like a cloud or like a nebula with the champions and how they all relate to each other. I failed miserably. I'll be honest with that. I failed miserably. This is the closest I could get. I know I showed this in Season 9. I wasn't able to make any more progress on it. But this is what the spectrum looks like if you actually matched it up to the relationships that I showed throughout this video. So this is kind of like the pretty version. This is the more messy version. So you can see like here, I've got Juggernauts linking to battle mages, and this one, Juggernauts don't link to battle mages. So this one is a little bit more accurate, but it's a little bit messier. So you can see like, if you want to move from Juggernauts to Vanguards, you go through the Diver class. So Juggernaut, Diver, Vanguard. If you want to go, say, from Juggernauts to Burst Mages, you would go Juggernauts to Battle Mages to Burst Mages. So you can see how every single class relates within a few champions. Like it only takes like 4 or 5 champions to get from one champion to any other champion within this diagram. The hardest ones to get to are obviously enchanters because they're only related to catchers and wardens. But for most other classes and most other champions, they're all related. There's only like a few champions in between any other champion. So I think that's kind of cool. It kind of shows how everything is on a spectrum, everything is related, and yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed it. All right, so I am going to share with you guys the new version of the calculator. You guys can check out that link. It's a view-only link, so you have to save it as your own. Here, I'll show you guys how to save it as your own thing. All right, so it's view-only, so you got to either like make a copy, you got to save it as a Google Sheet, or you got to download it. You can download either as an Excel or an open document format. So just for everybody, one last time. So the link I provided, it's view only. So you guys will not be able to edit it in any way, shape, or form. You will have to download it in order to be able to edit it. So you can save it, a copy of it. You can save it to your Google Sheets. You can download it either as an Excel file or an open source document, things like that. But you will not be able to edit that file. Stop asking me questions. Stop requesting to be able to edit the file. I will not allow you to edit the file. You'll have to save it as your own version. So yeah, so this is the tool. If anybody's confused in how it works, basically, you say what your priority is. So for me, I'd say like damage is a 3, and I could prefer more DPS and burst. It'll automatically update the ones in column F, so you only need to update column E. Toughness, I care more about toughness. I think I like sustain more than mitigation. Crowd control, pretty important. Definitely like hard more than soft. Mobility, I like a lot, and I definitely want to engage. Utility, I don't care that much about. And then range, I don't really care that much about it, but I like attacks more than abilities. You can see it recommends divers, skirmishers, vanguards for me. Hopefully it works for the rest of you guys. The link that I'm providing you guys is view only. So when you open it up, you have to save your own version. And that's so that people don't mess with it, right? Because I made it so that everybody could edit it. It would be broken within like 5 seconds. And then I'd have to fix it. So view only, so we have like a pristine copy. And then you guys create your own copy. You can create your own, you can copy it to your Google Sheets, or you can download it. And then you can play with it. And if you break it, then you break it. But that way we always have a pristine version up on the web. Yeah, so the goal with this tool is it will narrow it down to the subclasses. And then if you go to the next tab over, so there's 3 tabs. There's ideal class, champion classes, and key. You go to the next tab over, and it'll show you which champions are within each class. And then it's really designed for like more for people who are brand new, who have no idea what they're doing. And that way, those people could like choose those champions that are on free week. So maybe like Akali is on free week if they want to play assassins. I am going to be working on improving the tool. So I'm hoping maybe by season 11 or season 12, it won't just recommend a subclass. It'll recommend like actual champions. It'll like go down to like the champion level, and it'll say like you're 86% match with this champion or 50% match with this other champion. So I'm hoping to get it down to a level where it's so detailed that it will actually recommend like individual champions. It's not there yet. So that mostly won't happen until we get like a website operational. So long term, I'd like to get a website operational or some type of app that we can like have tools like a team comp tool, like a champion tool, things like that. Scouting tools, pro tools, things like that. So that's the long-term goal, but obviously need time and money to make those things happen, and I don't have much of either right now. So yeah, there's a lot of really interesting things you can do with this tool. Like for example, if like typically you have to choose between damage and utility, and you have to choose between toughness and range. You typically can't have both. So like I did mention like damage and utility, one of the only champions that's got that is Kale. Toughness and range, now you're getting into like, I'd say like battle mages are probably your best choice if you really want toughness and range. That's probably the best you're gonna get. You could argue maybe Juggernauts or I don't know, marksman. Yeah, that might not be the best. So yeah, you can get some weird ones. You get some weird things with this tool if you go for really weird things like toughness and range, or if you want to prioritize utility and damage. If you prioritize utility and damage, it recommends battle mages. So yeah, sometimes you'll get some weird things. If you guys get something weird, let me know, and I'll try to... I'm always trying to improve this. I'm always trying to make it better. Okay, guys. Thank you for the support. Thank you for showing up to this first stream. Very much appreciated. Obviously, I'm going to try and get better. I'm going to review this stream, take notes, get better. But this definitely is... yeah, thank you guys for showing up. I'll try to make this a regular thing every week, starting at 10 a.m., going as late as possible. And yeah, if you have any thoughts, if you guys have any recommendations for what stream topics I should cover, Discord is a great way to get a hold of me. I've got an actual channel for you can give stream ideas, things like that. And next week is going to be team compositions, and it's going to be a huge stream. So please show up to that one. I'm really proud of it already. So yeah, it's going to be really good. So hope you guys enjoy it. Have a great day. See you guys soon.